I stood in the kitchen doorway, clutching the plate Brooke had set out for me while laughter roared from the dining room table. "There's no room this year," she'd said sweetly, as if banishing me from my own son's life was an act of kindness. No chair, no place, no voice. After pawning my wedding ring for Ethan's down payment. After signing the mortgage that kept this house standing. After 61 years of being his mother, I was the one exiled on Christmas Eve. The next morning, the keys were mine again. All right. Before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The air outside was sharp with cold, brittle in the way that only a northeastern December could promise. Margaret's boots crunched over the salt-dusted walkway leading up to her son's colonial-style home, a string of warm white lights blinking along the gutters. She clutched the tin of cookies tighter against her chest, the scent of brown butter and molasses sneaking through the loose lid. The door opened before she knocked. "Hi, Margaret." Brooke beamed, her smile practiced. Too white, too bright. Margaret hesitated. She hated that Brooke never called her mom. "Merry Christmas," she said softly, lifting the tin. "Oh, you brought cookies," Brooke chirped. "How thoughtful. Just set them in the kitchen. We're about to eat." Margaret stepped inside. The warmth of the house hit her all at once. Fireplace heat, roasted meats, the cloying perfume of cinnamon plug-ins. Laughter echoed from the dining room. She passed by the foyer mirror. Her coat, navy wool, buttoned too high, looked out of place next to the designer shoes and monogrammed stockings hung along the banister. Her reflection flinched. The dining room looked like something out of a lifestyle magazine. Pine garlands and gold-trimmed china framed the long table. Silver-rimmed wine glasses glimmered under the chandelier. 13 place settings, every one precise. A flickering taper candle stood guard at each end. Brooke followed her in, voice just a touch too loud. "So, we actually had a bit of a space issue this year. Big turnout. You understand, right?" Margaret blinked. There's just no room at the table," Brooke said, her tone silk-hiding glass. "We didn't expect David to bring his girlfriend, or Uncle Josh's +1. But I made you a plate already." She gestured toward the kitchen. Margaret didn't move. She looked to Ethan, seated at the far end. He saw her, met her eyes, held them for barely a second, then looked away. "Come on, I'll show you." Brooke's manicured hand touched Margaret's elbow, steering her gently but firmly through the swinging kitchen door. The scent of honey-glazed ham filled the room, but there was no warmth here. Just cold tile, chrome appliances, and the soft hum of the refrigerator. A plate sat on the counter. Neat, balanced, a sprig of parsley on the mashed potatoes. "Help yourself to cider," Brooke said lightly. "We're doing a toast soon." And then she left. Margaret stood there alone, the tin of cookies still under her arm. She set it down gently, next to a bowl of whipped cranberry sauce. From the other room came the sound of clinking glasses and rising voices, toasts, laughter. She picked up the plate. There was nowhere to sit. No stool, no chair. She stood in the kitchen doorway, watching as everyone raised glasses, and Brooke made some joke that sent a ripple of polite laughter down the table. The kind that made people glance around to make sure they were laughing on cue. Then Brooke caught sight of her. "Oh, Margaret," she called across the room. "Don't just stand there. That plate's heavy. Maybe it's better if you finish up in here?" It wasn't a question. The guests shifted. Someone coughed. A cousin looked down at his napkin. A woman Margaret didn't recognize tried to smile at her, then quickly turned away. Margaret felt the air shift. Not colder, emptier. She set the plate down. The clink of ceramic on granite was louder than it should have been. "I should go," she said, not to anyone. No one stopped her. She walked to the entryway, pulling her coat on slowly, fingers fumbling at the buttons. Outside, snow was falling again, fat, slow flakes that caught in the glow of the porch light. Behind her, the door shut with a muffled click. She stepped into the silence. No footsteps followed. Each step down the walkway felt heavier than the last, as if the humiliation had settled into her bones. She didn't cry. Not yet. The snow melted against her flushed cheeks, and the wind stung, but she didn't cry. She reached her car, opened the door, sat. Only then, hands trembling against the steering wheel, did the tears come, hot and angry and useless. But under the grief, something colder stirred. It wasn't sadness. It was the quiet recognition of a final line being crossed. The wind screamed through the alleyways, turning corners like it was chasing her. Margaret pulled her scarf tighter, wool stiff with frozen breath. Her boots, leather split at the seams, slipped with every step. The salt had worn through the soles weeks ago. She hadn't driven home. She couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way her hands wouldn't stop shaking on the steering wheel. Maybe she needed the cold to keep her upright. Maybe she needed the walk to remember what had been taken from her. Icicles hung like silent accusations from the gutters overhead as she passed shuttered storefronts and dark windows lit only by flickering TVs. A dog barked from behind a chain-link fence, then fell quiet again. The street lamps buzzed, one blinking out just as she passed beneath it. By the time she reached her porch, the wind had turned her fingers numb, and her tears had frozen into salt tracks down her cheeks. She reached for the key tucked deep in her coat pocket, fingers fumbling clumsily at the rusted lock. The door creaked as it opened. Warm air greeted her like an afterthought. The house smelled of pine logs and lavender floor polish, clean, quiet, forgotten. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her with a soft thud. The wind muffled instantly. Only silence remained. The fire in the hearth had burned low, just embers now. Still, it gave off a stubborn heat that lit the room in soft flickers of orange and gold. In front of it sat that chair. Old oak, high back, carved arms rubbed smooth by decades of wear. Her husband's chair once. After he passed, it had become hers. She used to rock Ethan to sleep in it. Later, he'd sit there in his pajamas while she read aloud before school. Now, it just stared at her. Empty. Quiet. Mocking. She didn't sit. Couldn't. Instead, she moved to the bookshelf, dusty and uneven, and reached for the silver frame tucked behind a row of Reader's Digest anthologies. Ethan's kindergarten photo, his front teeth missing, his ears too big for his head, a smear of chocolate on his chin. She touched the glass, and then the memory came uninvited. That summer, 22 years ago, when he called from his beat-up Honda outside a foreclosure office. "Mom, they accepted my offer," he'd said breathlessly. "I just need $5,000 more to lock it in." He hadn't even asked. She'd sold her wedding ring that afternoon. The necklace, too, the one her mother gave her on her wedding day. Pawned for a down payment on a future where she imagined Christmas mornings and grandkids on her lap. She never told him what it had cost. A few weeks later, she sat in the bank lobby beside him as he signed mortgage papers, her signature quietly following his at the bottom. Co-signer. No fanfare, just trust. And now she wasn't even worth a chair. Her gaze returned to the hearth. They sat in that house, the one she helped build, passing cranberry sauce and raising their glasses. And she was shivering in a half-lit cottage with secondhand insulation and a furnace that coughed like a smoker when it kicked in. She didn't notice she was crying again until her lips started to sting from the cold. This time, she didn't wipe the tears away. She walked to the fireplace, picked up a half-burned log and dropped it back onto the embers. Sparks leapt up, angry and wild, flashing briefly against the photo frame still clutched in her hand. Margaret's voice came out low, barely a whisper, but it landed in the room like a vow. They sit in that house because of me. The fire cracked, and something deep inside her shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. But it was the kind of shift that never moves backward. The fire had died to a whisper by the time she moved again. Margaret stood barefoot on the cold wood floor, the photo still on the mantel. Her shoulders ached from tension she hadn't realized she was holding. The room was dim now, just gray dawn creeping through the frost-laced windows. She turned, walked slowly to the corner hutch, and knelt. The bottom drawer stuck, as always. She yanked harder, the old wood groaning in protest before finally giving way. Inside were paper stacks tucked into plastic sleeves, their corners curled, their labels handwritten in fading ink. Receipts, statements, letters, and under them all, the file she hadn't touched in years. Ethan. House docs. Her hands hesitated above it, then closed. She brought the folder to the dining table and laid each document out like she was setting a dinner for ghosts. The original mortgage, the co-signature agreement, insurance binders, tax forms. A copy of the deed. She scanned until she found the line that mattered. Guarantor, Margaret L. Connolly. Joint responsibility in case of default. She let out a breath. It was shakier than she expected. He'd never taken her off the loan. Never refinanced, despite the promises. One day, he'd said, that time after Brooke got her big promotion. We'll get everything squared away. You shouldn't have to carry it forever. But he had let her. He still did. She stared at the paperwork as if it might change with time or fury, but the names stayed printed in ink. Permanent. A knock startled her. 3 sharp raps. Friendly, familiar. Margaret blinked, then rose stiffly and opened the door. "Geez," Doris said, squinting past her. "Did you even sleep last night?" Margaret offered a tired smile. "Not really." Doris stepped inside, tugging her knit cap off. Her hair, short and silver, stood up at odd angles. She smelled like peppermint and drugstore perfume. "Your porch light's still on. That means one of 2 things. You're baking before dawn, or something's wrong." She glanced toward the dining table. "Definitely not baking," Doris muttered, moving closer. "What is all this?" "Just old papers," Margaret said, rubbing her arms. "Mortgage records, Ethan's house." Doris gave her a sideways look. "Why now?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She pulled out one page and held it toward her friend. Her finger tapped the bottom corner. Her name, in tidy legal font, still holding weight. "I'm still on it," she said. "All these years. After everything I gave to help him get that place. I never stopped holding the risk." Doris's eyes narrowed. "He didn't refinance?" "Not once," Margaret said. "And now," her throat tightened, "now they treat me like a burden. Like I don't belong at the table I helped set." She hadn't meant to say it. Not out loud. Doris didn't flinch. She leaned forward, palms braced on the table's edge, scanning the documents like a detective on a crime scene. "They know you're still on it?" "Oh, I'm sure Ethan does," Margaret replied. "Whether he remembers, wants to remember, is another thing." There was a silence. Then Doris straightened, her expression sharp. "Then maybe it's time you stand up." Margaret looked at her. "You helped build that house," Doris said. "You co-signed the loan. You gave up your jewelry, your credit, your security. So your son and his Barbie wife could play house in a 5-bedroom colonial. And now they want you to pretend you're invisible?" Her voice cracked through the air like kindling catching flame. "You don't owe them your silence." Margaret sat down slowly. She looked again at the papers. The house was still hers. Not in the way that made her feel welcome, but in the way that mattered in court. A warmth stirred in her chest. Not comfort, not love. It was something heavier, sharper. A strange relief, like finding out the weapon they used to hurt you is actually still in your hand. Her fingers curled around the edge of the contract. She didn't smile, but her eyes, for the first time in days, didn't look tired. The next morning, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a mug of lukewarm tea and the iPad she rarely used, except to track weather and grocery coupons. Today, her fingers hovered over the Facebook icon. She opened it. Brooke's post sat right at the top of her feed. Christmas at the Connollys. Grateful. Full hearts. Full house. 12 tagged names. 5 photos. 1 lie. There was the table. Garland-lined, candlelit, glowing. Brooke was in the center, laughing like someone had said the funniest thing on earth. Ethan sat beside her, arm loosely draped behind her chair. David, his girlfriend, Uncle Josh. Even the new co-worker from Brooke's firm. They were all there. What wasn't? Any trace that Margaret had ever walked through that door. No cookies on the counter, no chair missing, no mention. She wasn't tagged, not even in the background. It was as if she hadn't existed at all. Her thumb hovered over the like button, then moved away. Across town, behind the double-height windows of Ethan's house, Brooke leaned back on the velvet chaise in her office-turned-studio. She scrolled through the comments on her post, tapping hearts, replying with perfectly curated emojis. Downstairs, the dishwasher beeped. She ignored it. A FedEx envelope lay unopened on her desk, partially buried under a West Elm catalog and a stack of glossy thank you notes she hadn't written yet. Her nails, red and glossy, tapped a rhythm against her phone screen. Notifications kept coming. She tucked the envelope deeper under the pile without looking at the return address. From the hallway, Ethan's voice drifted up. "Hey, did the power bill come in?" "I think it's in the stack," Brooke called back. "I'll get to it later." Ethan didn't reply. He stood in the kitchen, staring at the nearly empty fridge. A half carton of eggs. Some salad mix, wilted at the edges. The ham was already gone. He closed the door and rubbed his eyes. When they'd bought this house, it had felt like a dream. Now it felt like a performance they couldn't stop giving. He pulled out his phone and opened the banking app. Credit card pending balance. 12,387. Mortgage payment due in 6 days. No paycheck until next Friday. No savings to cushion the fall. He closed the app, walked to the sink, ran water just to hear something other than the silence of knowing things were slipping. Meanwhile, back in Margaret's kitchen, Doris paced. "Do you see it now?" she asked, gesturing toward the tablet Margaret had pushed aside. "I do," Margaret said quietly. "Good," Doris muttered. "Because that woman's built a castle on your back and blocked the drawbridge." Margaret looked out the window. The snow had started again. Fine, glittering flakes that melted on impact with the glass. "I used to think it was enough to know the truth," she said. "Even if nobody else did." Doris stopped pacing. "But now?" Margaret went on, her voice firmer. "Now I see what they do with my silence. They scrub me out of the story." "And they get away with it because you've let them," Doris said, not unkindly. "That stops now." Margaret nodded once. She stood up, walked across the kitchen, pulled a drawer open with more force than necessary, and grabbed a yellow notepad. She wrote down the name of a lawyer she remembered from church. Eleanor Blake. Probate, estate, civil. "Are you serious?" Doris asked, watching her. "I'm not doing this to destroy them," Margaret said, placing the pen down. "But I won't let them erase me." She tore off the page and slid it into her purse. The spark that had ignited the night before was no longer just heat. It was direction. The office smelled of leather and old books, a sharp contrast to the chill of the January morning. The walls were lined with bookshelves, stacked high with tomes and faded case files. The windows were narrow, too small to bring in much of the weak sunlight, but large enough to show the gray city street outside. A draft moved through the cracks in the old building, making the low hum of the overhead lights feel even more distant. Margaret's hands were clammy as she set her purse down on the desk. She took a seat in front of Mr. Halpern, the lawyer who'd agreed to meet with her. His office was quiet, too quiet, filled with the heavy scent of wood and formality. Halpern was a man of few words. He wore a dark suit, his glasses perched low on his nose. A professional, perhaps to a fault, but that was what she needed. Someone who saw legalese and paperwork as a battleground, not just a job. "You brought everything I requested?" he asked, his voice even, neutral. She nodded, sliding a manila folder across the desk toward him. Her fingers shook. She didn't know why. Perhaps it was the thought of what this would mean, what it might cost. Perhaps it was the feeling of finally doing something, after years of suffocating silence. Halpern flipped through the papers quickly, his eyes scanning, taking in the mortgage documents, the deed, the loan agreement. He didn't look up until he'd finished. "Good," he said, setting the papers down in front of him. "Everything is in order. I see where you're listed as the guarantor. They never took you off the deed, as you said." His eyes met hers, sharp. "You have leverage here. A lot more than you might think." Margaret sat back, her throat tightening. She'd known this, hadn't she? But hearing it said aloud was different. The house, her son's house, the one they'd built on her sacrifices, on her blood really, was still tied to her in a way they couldn't escape. Brooke's smug smile, Ethan's indifference. It all seemed so fragile now, so thin. "You're telling me I could take it back," Margaret said, her voice a little more brittle than she intended. Her fingers traced the edge of the house deed, the one paper she'd refused to touch until now. "You're telling me I can take the house back?" Halpern leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I'm saying the law is on your side. You are still legally attached to that property. If you want, we can file for a claim. You could petition to take possession of the house. As the co-signer and the primary guarantor, you have the right to move forward with legal action." Margaret swallowed hard. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest, the realization that she could do something. She could make it right. Or more likely, make it wrong. Wrong in a way they'd never see coming. "But it won't be easy," Halpern added, his voice growing colder. "This will not be a quiet battle. It will be public. It could strain your relationship with your son permanently. Your daughter-in-law." Her pulse quickened. His words were too gentle, too cautious. Was he warning her, or just stating the facts? "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Halpern asked, his gaze unwavering. "Once you start this, there's no going back." Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of the deed, feeling the grain of the paper beneath her fingertips. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. She'd been trembling for too long, for months, years. Her entire life, it seemed. "They left me no chair at their table," she whispered, a flicker of fire igniting in her chest. She didn't look at Halpern. She didn't need to. "They took everything, and now I'll take what's mine." Halpern's brow furrowed just slightly before he nodded. "I'll begin preparing the paperwork. It will take time, but we can move quickly if you're committed." "I'm committed," Margaret said firmly, her voice solid, unwavering. Halpern took the papers she'd provided and slid them into a folder. His movements quick and efficient. He placed the folder in front of her, pushing it toward her with a finality that made Margaret's pulse skip. She took the folder in her hands, feeling the weight of it like a promise, like a weapon. It felt heavier than anything she'd ever held. The idea of taking back the house, taking back control, suddenly didn't seem like a distant dream. It was here, now, in her hands. She stood, clutching the folder, and met Halpern's eyes. The legal world, this world of strategy and paperwork, of power and leverage, was no longer something she watched from the outside. It was her world now. Halpern stood with her, extending his hand. "You'll hear from me soon." Margaret shook his hand, her grip firm. "Thank you, Mr. Halpern." She walked out of his office with the folder tucked securely under her arm, a sense of clarity taking hold. This was no longer about revenge. It was about reclaiming her life, her dignity, her right to be seen. And in the back of her mind, as she walked down the cold, sterile hallway, a thought echoed, "They won't erase me again." The apartment was silent, save for the occasional pop from the radiator and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Margaret sat at the small dining table, the folder with the legal papers open in front of her, the words on the page blurring as her eyes drifted out the window instead. The streetlights outside flickered weakly in the snowstorm, casting long shadows across the room. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the contract. The deed. The letter from Halpern. The weight of it all pressed on her chest like a hand around her ribs. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about it since she left his office. She had come so far. She'd taken the first step, a step she'd never thought she could take. And now it was here. What comes next? Her thoughts drifted back to Ethan, to the little boy he used to be, his wide, innocent eyes, the way he'd clutch her hand on the way to school, the way he'd crawl into her lap after a long day, needing comfort in the simplicity of her arms. He had been hers then, before the world and the pull of ambition had stretched him far away from her. She closed her eyes, a knot tightening in her throat. She remembered his first day of kindergarten, how he stood, nervous but excited, in the hallway of the school. She had to pry his fingers from the doorframe when it was time to leave, holding back tears of her own. She'd left him then, but he had grown, blossomed, leaving behind the shy boy who couldn't look anyone in the eye. She'd done what a mother did, sacrificed everything to build him a future in a house that now seemed as distant as his childhood smile. Her eyes fell on the legal papers again. She let her fingers trace the edges, but this time, the touch felt less like resolve and more like doubt. Was this the right thing to do? Her heart twisted in her chest. She remembered their conversations, those quiet moments when she'd asked him to promise, to take care of things. "One day, Mom. One day I'll take you off the papers. I'll get everything settled. You won't have to carry this weight anymore." But those days never came. Years passed, and the weight was still hers. And now, she stood on the edge of a precipice, ready to tear it all down. "God, I should never have let it get this far," she whispered aloud to the empty room, her fingers trembling. Was it worth it? The idea of legal action, of reclaiming what she had sacrificed, her pride, her life, was still raw. So raw. A knock at the door broke through her spiraling thoughts. It was quick, forceful, Doris, as always. Margaret felt her heart give a little jolt, though she tried to ignore it. She hadn't expected company. "Come in," Margaret called out softly, not even bothering to get up. The door opened, and Doris stepped inside, her boots leaving a trail of slush as she entered. She was wearing that same thick, worn coat, the one she always wore on these visits. Her eyes were sharp, her lips pressed together in a line. "Worried about you," Doris said, her voice blunt, almost gruff. "You look like you're about to set fire to those papers and throw them out the window." Margaret didn't respond, just stared down at the documents in front of her. "Talk to me," Doris said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her, folding her arms. "What's going through that head of yours?" Margaret closed her eyes. The doubts were so loud, too loud to ignore now. "I don't know," she said, her voice unsteady. "It's all happening so fast. I thought I wanted this. But now." Doris let out a soft, irritated sigh. "Margaret," she said, her tone sharpening. "You've been holding the weight of this for years, your whole life, And you've been walking around with their disrespect in your heart for just as long. This, this isn't charity. This is respect. You've earned it. They pushed you out of their lives. But you're not staying out of the fight, are you? Margaret blinked. Doris's words hung in the air like a challenge. She hadn't come here to coddle her, she came here to snap her out of it. Margaret sat up straighter, feeling the fire begin to rise in her chest again. The shame, the confusion, everything she'd held onto for so long, started to feel like a weight she no longer needed to carry. She stood up suddenly, the papers in front of her trembling hands now feeling more like a shield than a burden. Respect isn't charity. Doris was right. Doris was always right. Margaret moved to the small writing desk in the corner and pulled open a drawer, retrieving an old journal that had been gathering dust. She opened it to a blank page and, with quick strokes, began to write. Her pen moved with purpose, her hand steady as she filled the page with her thoughts. They pushed me out, but I'm walking back in differently. She paused, looking down at the words, then wrote underneath it, "They can't take what I've built." Outside, the snow fell steadily, covering the world in a thick blanket of white. Each flake felt like judgment, a reminder of the silence she had endured and the cold she had lived through. But now, there was warmth in her chest, a different kind of warmth. She wasn't going to let them erase her anymore. The snow was falling heavier now, thick flakes drifting sideways in the night wind, blurring the edges of the world outside Margaret's windshield. She hadn't planned to drive by Ethan's house. She hadn't even meant to leave her apartment today, but somehow, her hands had turned the wheel. And here she was, just a few blocks away, on the same street she used to walk when Ethan was little, before the weight of everything had pulled him away from her. She slowed as she approached the block, her headlights illuminating the soft white blanket that covered the lawns. The house loomed ahead, elegant in its own way, but to Margaret, it no longer looked like home. It looked like a house built on her sacrifices, and it felt hollow now. Brooke's laugh rang out from the driveway, light and musical, drifting through the cold air. Margaret's eyes caught sight of her, standing with a group of friends, hands gesturing widely, laughter spilling out as if there were no care in the world. Brooke looked so put together, the picture of success. The very opposite of Margaret, unseen, forgotten, the one who had made it all possible. Margaret's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, the small, hard lump of keys in her purse pressing against her side, the extra house keys, the ones that had once belonged to her, before everything had changed, before she had become invisible. The driveway was lined with more cars than usual, 2 shiny SUVs, a sleek sedan. Their world, the one she was no longer a part of. Her eyes flicked to the mailbox near the curb. It was stuffed to overflowing with envelopes, the white edges of overdue bills poking out from the sides. She could almost hear the silence between those letters, the ones that spoke of struggles hidden beneath the polished facade of the life they paraded around, the life they expected to continue without her. Margaret's heart tightened, but she didn't look away. "This is my fight now," she reminded herself. "I've waited long enough. No more silence." As she sat idling in the street, her eyes found Ethan standing in the doorway. He stepped out onto the porch, adjusting his jacket, the cold air swirling around him. He glanced toward the street, his eyes catching her car for just a split second. And then, he looked away. It was subtle, but it was there. The brief flicker of recognition, followed by the swift retreat of his gaze. As though he knew she was here, but he wasn't ready to acknowledge it. The ache in Margaret's chest deepened. She had spent so many years trying to understand him, trying to hold on to the person he used to be, but that person was gone. The distance between them was real, and it was as though it had all led to this moment, This silent acknowledgement of the truths they both knew but refused to face. Margaret's fingers curled into a fist, the keys digging into her palm. She could leave. She could turn the car around, pull away, and never come back. But she didn't. With a deliberate breath, she parked at the curb, leaving the engine running, the light from the street lamp casting shadows across the dashboard. She sat for a moment, watching as Ethan stepped back into the house, leaving the door slightly ajar. She reached for her purse, her hand trembling slightly as she fished out the house keys. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal, the weight of it in her hand, a reminder of the past, a symbol of control she had lost, but not anymore. Margaret stared at the keys, a chill spreading through her body, not from the cold, but from the resolve that was suddenly tightening around her like a steel band. Tomorrow, she would take control of her life again. The house, the papers, everything. It's mine again. She whispered the words softly, as if to remind herself. Tomorrow, those won't belong to you. The snow fell in steady, quiet layers outside her window, each flake marking time as it drifted from the dark sky to the earth below. She had stayed away for long enough. The time had come to take it all back, no matter the cost. Her heart raced with the rush of realization. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about her, the woman she had buried for so long beneath the weight of everyone else's needs. This was about reclaiming her own story. She slipped the keys back into her purse, the sound of them soft in the silence. She started the car again, her gaze lingering one last time on the house, the family she had once known. And then she pulled away, driving into the snowy night, the road ahead uncertain but filled with the promise of something she had almost forgotten: freedom. The phone rang early the next morning. Margaret was sitting at the small kitchen table, the curtains pulled back just enough to watch the snow fall in thick blankets. The world outside felt distant, muffled by the storm. She had already made her decision. She glanced at the phone, the name on the screen familiar, yet somehow distant. Ethan. Her finger hovered over the screen for a moment, the weight of it hanging there like a question. It felt strange to be on the other side of this call, strange in a way that almost made her hesitate. But she didn't. She swiped to answer. "Hi, Mom." Ethan's voice was clipped, the sound of paper rustling in the background like he was reading something, checking something. "Ethan," she replied, keeping her voice even, neutral. There was a brief pause. She could tell he was deciding how to start, how to frame this. "Listen, I need a favor." Margaret straightened in her chair, the sound of his voice like a trigger pulling her deeper into the moment. "What kind of favor?" she asked, knowing exactly what was coming but still bracing herself for the words. He exhaled sharply, his voice faltering slightly. It's about the house. The mortgage payment is coming up. And we're really stretched right now. Brooks, well, she's really stressed and I don't know what else to do. Could you help cover it for the next couple of months? Just until things settle down? It's temporary." There it was. The request she had known was coming. Margaret stared out the window, watching the snow dance in the wind, her fingers tightly gripping the edge of her cup. Her heart thudded in her chest, but her voice remained calm. "No," she said simply. Ethan's breath caught on the line. There was a long silence before he spoke again, his tone edged with desperation. "Mom, I know things have been tight, but this isn't... Brooke's been under so much pressure with work. And it's just temporary. You know how much we've been juggling." Margaret's gaze fixed on the thickening snow outside, the flakes blurring the world in front of her. Her pulse raced, but she remained still, each word deliberate. "Was throwing me out temporary too?" she asked softly, the words cutting through the silence like glass. The phone went quiet. The seconds stretched long between them, the weight of the question settling between mother and son like a heavy stone. He didn't answer immediately. She could hear him on the other end, breathing, struggling for words. She didn't break the silence. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice softer now, but full of tension. "Mom, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never meant for you to be left out. It's just, everything's been so hard." Margaret closed her eyes, letting the quiet wash over her. She could hear the guilt in his voice, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to undo what had been done. The door he'd closed behind her, no explanation, no apology, was still there, wide and heavy. And now, standing in front of him, she was not going to let him pull her back into it. "I'm sorry, Ethan, but no." She repeated it, her voice firm. "You made your choices. I've made mine." Another beat of silence. "I have to go," he said, the words a mixture of relief and defeat. Then the line went dead. Margaret didn't move. She didn't cry. There was no rush to end the conversation. The silence on the other end of the line had already spoken volumes. Minutes passed before Doris's knock echoed through the door. Margaret set the phone down slowly and walked to answer it. Doris stood there, her face softened by concern, but her eyes sharp with understanding. Without a word, she stepped inside and closed the door behind her, already knowing what had happened. "They'll understand when it's too late," Doris said, her voice low but steady. "Don't let him pull you back into it. Not after everything you've given." Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned back toward the kitchen, pulling the chair out with a quiet scrape of wood. She sat down, her hands folding in her lap. The room felt different. It wasn't the snow outside or the quiet in her bones. It was the realization that she was standing on the edge of something irreversible. Ethan had made his choice. He had drawn the line. And now, she had to draw hers. Doris moved to sit across from her, folding her arms, waiting for Margaret to speak. Margaret took a deep breath and slowly exhaled. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice steady, as if she had finally found the words that had been locked inside her for years. "I've given everything, but no more." Doris didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to push. She simply nodded, her expression calm but resolute. Margaret's hand reached for the papers on the table, the ones she had once been afraid to touch, and pulled them closer. Tomorrow was coming, and she was ready. The wind had died down slightly by the time Margaret made her way to the grocery store, but the snow was still thick on the ground. It clung to her boots with each step, settling into the fabric of her coat, and her breath billowed in thick clouds before disappearing into the gray sky. It was a normal enough morning, the kind of day that would usually pass without notice. But today, the world felt heavier. Word had already started to spread. About her, about the house, about the choices she'd made. Margaret could feel the eyes on her as she walked down the aisles, the hushed murmurs that stopped whenever she passed. She hadn't even been in the store 5 minutes before she overheard 2 women speaking in low tones, their glances darting toward her. "You heard?" one of them asked, voice just a little too loud. "Margaret Connolly is taking Ethan's house. Can you believe that?" The other woman leaned in, eyes wide. "I heard she's fighting him for it. She's trying to get it back. After all those years of helping them, it's cold, don't you think?" Margaret paused by the canned goods, her fingers brushing across the shelves, pretending she hadn't heard. But the words stung, each one hitting like a shard of glass, slicing through the thin layer of calm she'd been holding together. Taking Ethan's house. That's how they saw it. Not reclaiming what was hers. Not standing up for the sacrifices she'd made. She stood there a moment longer, letting the words settle. And then, as if on cue, she heard the unmistakable, sharp voice of Brooke across the aisle. "Well, if it isn't Margaret Connolly herself," Brooke called out, her tone dripping with faux sweetness. "I've heard the rumors, of course. Can't believe you're making things so public. But I guess that's what you want, right? Make sure everyone knows how bitter you are." Margaret turned slowly to face her, taking in the sight of Brooke. Designer jacket, perfectly styled hair, all the trappings of a life that seemed perfect on the outside. But Margaret knew better now. She had learned that perfection was the thinnest mask of all. "Hello, Brooke," Margaret said evenly, her voice calm despite the fury boiling just beneath her skin. "I'm not here for gossip." Brooke's laugh was short and sharp, and she stepped closer, making sure her voice carried. "You're really going through with it then? After everything Ethan's done for you? This is how you repay him?" Her eyes flicked to the other shoppers nearby, ensuring the spotlight was on her. "It's pathetic, really. Just bitter and petty. I mean, who even does that to their own son?" Margaret's grip on the shopping cart tightened, but her face remained impassive. She wasn't going to let Brooke's words push her. She wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a response. "I don't need your approval, Brooke," Margaret said quietly, her voice steel beneath the calm. "Or anyone's. I've made my choice." Brooke's smile faltered just for a second before it snapped back into place. She turned away, huffing as she walked toward the checkout, muttering something under her breath. Margaret stayed in the aisle for a moment longer, her thoughts spinning. She could feel the eyes of the store on her. The whispers were already swirling. Was she really that woman? The one who had come back to claim what she was owed, no matter the cost? A chill ran through her, but she pushed it down, choosing instead to finish her shopping with a quiet determination. When Margaret returned home, the phone was already ringing. She didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Ethan. She stared at the phone, her heart pounding in her chest before swiping to answer. "Mom." Ethan's voice was shaky, strained. I don't know what to say, but please, just think about this. Please. It's not too late. You're not being fair." She closed her eyes, her hand clutching the phone tightly. "I've thought about it, Ethan. I've thought about it long enough," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not changing my mind." There was a long silence on the other end, and then the quiet sound of Ethan's breath hitching, as if he were struggling to find the words. "You're really going through with it, aren't you?" "I have to," she answered simply. "I've given too much. For too long. I'm begging you, Mom," he pleaded, the desperation clear in his voice. "Please. This isn't you. Don't do this." Margaret's jaw clenched. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice clipped, before she ended the call, her thumb shaking as she pressed the screen. She let the phone fall to the table and stared at it for a long moment. The weight of her decision pressing down on her. There was nothing left to say. Nothing left to change. A few minutes later, Doris knocked softly at the door, her usual quiet presence filling the space. Margaret opened it, and Doris stepped in, holding a small basket of fresh bread. "Things are heating up, I take it," Doris said, her gaze steady as she set the basket on the kitchen counter. "What's next?" Margaret gave a soft, resigned smile. "Tomorrow, I start planning my own Christmas dinner. Just me, you, and the friends from church. I'm done being erased." Doris nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. Margaret wasn't alone in this. Not anymore. The knock came earlier than Margaret expected, sharp and insistent, breaking the silence of her quiet morning. She stood by the window, watching the courier pull up in his nondescript van, the snow still swirling in gusts around his feet as he carried the heavy envelope to her door. When Margaret opened it, the sight of the thick, official-looking papers in the courier's hands made her heart beat just a little faster. He handed her the envelope with a courteous nod, his face offering nothing but a professional indifference. Margaret took it with steady hands, careful not to reveal any trace of the pounding she felt in her chest. "Thank you," she said, closing the door behind him without a second glance. She stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the paper in her hands as if it were the heaviest thing in the world. Her fingers trembled slightly as she peeled open the envelope, and there they were. Official, final, the foreclosure notice. It was done. The house was now legally tied to her. Ethan and Brooke's struggles, their debt, their lives, everything they had so carefully built had come crashing down under the weight of the contract Margaret had co-signed all those years ago. There was no going back now. Across the street, the quiet suburban street was suddenly pierced by an angry voice. "What the hell?" Margaret's gaze snapped to the window. Outside, Brooke was standing in front of Ethan's house, the foreclosure notice clenched in her hands, her face pale and contorted with rage. The neighbors were watching, gathering by their windows, some of them even on the porch. Brooke's voice, shrill and panicked, carried to Margaret like the sound of a bell tolling. "This isn't fair," Brooke shouted, her voice cracking. "You can't do this to us, after everything we've been through." Margaret didn't flinch. She simply watched as Brooke continued to rant, shaking the notice like it was a weapon, her face flushed with humiliation. Ethan stood beside her, his posture slumped, shoulders rounded, his face ashen and defeated. There was no fire in his eyes now, only a hollow resignation. He glanced toward the window of the house, his gaze briefly meeting Margaret's, but he didn't make a move to come outside. He didn't even seem to care enough to defend her. Margaret let out a quiet breath and turned away from the window. She could feel the heaviness of the moment, but it didn't have the sting it once would have. The years of sacrifice, of waiting, of letting them step all over her, they had led to this. And now, for the first time, Margaret felt something. She didn't feel triumph, exactly. No, it wasn't like that. But she felt the weight of her decisions, firm, final, and hers. This wasn't about destroying anyone. It was about her reclaiming what she had given away for far too long. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to set, Margaret received the call from Halpern. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "It's done. The paperwork has been processed. You're in control now." Margaret's heart slowed to a steady rhythm as she listened. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice calm, the finality of it settling deep inside her. She hung up and turned to the small pile of Christmas decorations on the table. A few garlands, some small lights, nothing too extravagant, but enough to fill the room with a quiet warmth. It was a different kind of holiday spirit this year. No family drama, no grand feasts at Ethan's house, no forced smiles, just her. She grabbed the garlands and stepped outside, her boots crunching softly in the snow. The world was still. The neighborhood was calm, save for the faint murmur of voices from across the street. Margaret didn't look that way again. Instead, she hung the decorations slowly, methodically, each movement deliberate as the lights twinkled softly against the early dusk. When she was done, she stepped back to admire the porch. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. The simple act of it, taking control, making this space her own, felt like a quiet revolution. Inside, Doris was waiting, the sound of glasses clinking in the kitchen. Margaret walked back in, her steps light, her face soft with the first real peace she'd felt in years. Doris was standing by the counter, a bottle of wine in one hand, 2 glasses in the other. She didn't say anything as she poured the wine, just smiled with a knowing look in her eyes. Margaret took the glass with a quiet smile of her own. "Merry Christmas." "Early," Doris said, her voice warm, accepting. Margaret lifted the glass, her fingers curling around the stem as she looked out the window. The snow had slowed, and the world outside was wrapped in a blanket of stillness. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of closure. It wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. The day after Christmas, the sky was a bleak, pale gray, and the snow had settled into a heavy, silent stillness. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the fire in the hearth crackling softly, casting flickering shadows across the room. She hadn't yet ventured outside that morning. She had more pressing things to face, things she had been avoiding for years. She pulled out the cardboard box from the top shelf of the closet. It was old, yellowed with age, and stuffed with letters, pictures, and memories. Ethan's childhood was in that box, tucked away and forgotten in the rush of life. But not today. Today, she needed to face it all. She started with a stack of letters, tied together with a piece of string. Some of them were from when Ethan was 5, others from middle school, some from high school. Little fragments of a life she had given everything to. The familiar scrawl on the first envelope made her chest tighten. To Mom, from Ethan, you're the best mom ever. I love you. She ran her fingers over the letter, the paper feeling fragile beneath her touch. Each word was a memory. His childhood innocence, his trust, his love. The ache in her chest deepened as she read the familiar, looping handwriting. And then, the guilt came. A sharp, icy jab. Am I doing the right thing? She thought, staring down at the letter. She had always been there for him. Every scraped knee, every school play, every triumph. But now she was the one causing the hurt, the one standing in the way of his dreams. She had made her choice, but it didn't make her feel any less guilty. Was it worth it? Was it worth the pain she was causing? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft knock on the door. Doris, as always, didn't wait for an invitation. She opened the door with a smile, stepping in with a bottle of wine in her hand. You need a distraction, I take it, Doris said, raising an eyebrow at the box of letters on the table. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She pushed the letters aside, her mind still tangled in the emotions they stirred. I'm just going through some old things, she murmured, picking up another letter. This one from Ethan in high school, filled with the excitement of a new relationship, his first job, the hope in his eyes that everything would turn out perfectly. But now it all felt like a distant memory, something too fragile to hold on to. Doris set the wine down on the counter and walked over, picking up one of the letters. I know you're struggling with this, she said softly. But remember, it wasn't you who destroyed the family. That was Brooke. She didn't just push you aside, she tore it apart. Margaret met Doris's gaze, her eyes tired but determined. Doris was right. It had been Brooke. It wasn't Margaret's fault. She had given everything, sacrificed so much. But in the end, she had been the one discarded. She wasn't the one who had pulled the rug out from under her own family. It wasn't me. A wave of clarity washed over her, and her resolve strengthened. But as she looked down at the stack of letters, the memories of Ethan's childhood, her heart ached in a way she couldn't explain. Was this what it had all come to? She picked up the Christmas card from Brooke. It was the one from last year, shiny, fake gold lettering that read, "Wishing you joy and peace this holiday season," with a perfect picture of their family on the front. Ethan, Brooke, the house, everything polished and beautiful. She could feel the mockery in it, the way Brooke had never truly cared for her. Slowly, Margaret tore the card in half. Then, she took the pieces, threw them into the fireplace, and watched as they crinkled and burned. The flames danced in front of her, warm and bright, the paper curling and turning to ash. The smoke rose, twisting upward, just as her own regrets seemed to vanish in the heat. Doris stood nearby, her arms crossed, watching the flames. Let it burn, she said softly. That's the past. You're not living there anymore. Margaret didn't speak. She simply watched the card burn, its gold lettering flickering into nothingness. until there was only a pile of ash left in the fire. The warmth of the flames spread through her, a catharsis she didn't know she needed. The weight that had clung to her for so long, guilt, regret, the fear of destroying everything, began to lift, replaced with something more solid, something that felt like peace. She whispered the words before she even realized she was saying them. New beginnings. The fire crackled and Doris walked over, pouring wine into 2 glasses. She handed one to Margaret, who took it with a steady hand. "Here's to new beginnings," Doris said quietly, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Margaret raised the glass, her fingers curling around the stem. For the first time in years, she felt something real. She was ready to live her life for herself. Outside, the snow continued to fall in soft, steady layers, the world outside blanketed in white. But Margaret knew that inside, the world was shifting. It was no longer about Ethan. It was about her. And for the first time, she didn't need anyone's approval. The small cottage was filled with the aroma of roasting chicken, the sweet scent of cinnamon and pine from the handmade wreath on the door. Margaret moved between the mismatched chairs she had set around the old wooden table, placing the last of the napkins down with deliberate care. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. A few extra chairs had been added to the room, for the neighbors, the widows, the veterans she had invited, the ones who needed a little warmth, a little company, and a place to feel seen. Outside, the snow had started to fall again, soft and light, blanketing the world in a quiet shroud. But inside, the cottage glowed with a warmth that had been missing for too long. Margaret stepped back to survey the room, her heart swelling as she looked over the gathering. There was an easy laughter now, a comfortable hum that filled the space. Doris was already chatting with Mrs. Calloway, the elderly woman from down the road, while a few of the veterans from the local center sat near the fireplace, swapping stories of Christmases past. It wasn't the grand, showy affair she used to have at Ethan's house, but it was real. It was home. She watched as her guests settled in. Her guests, people who had no reason to be here except that they had been invited. People who, in their own quiet ways, had all been pushed aside, just like her. Now, they were here, together. And Margaret realized this was what she had been missing. Not the grand holiday dinners, not the perfect decorations or the flawless image of a family at Christmas. No, what she had been missing was the connection, the sense of belonging. And here, in her humble cottage, in this new life, she was finally seen. She felt something inside her settle, a sense of peace she hadn't known she was looking for. Across town, things were much different. Brooke's hands moved quickly as she packed her things, throwing clothes into a suitcase with barely contained frustration. Her movements were sharp, almost angry. Every few moments she would pause, glance over at Ethan, who was sitting on the couch in the living room, eyes unfocused, staring at nothing. He hadn't said much since the call with his mother, since everything had fallen apart. Brooke slammed the suitcase shut with a finality that echoed through the silent house. "Are we really doing this?" she snapped, her voice brittle. Ethan didn't answer. He hadn't answered much at all in the last few hours. His face was pale, drawn, his eyes dull. The house that had once felt like a symbol of their success, now felt cold and empty. The lights on the tree flickered dimly, as if they too had lost their will to shine. Brooke huffed, running a hand through her hair. "Fine. I'm going then. You stay here. Do whatever you want." She turned, heading toward the door, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor. But Ethan didn't move. He didn't even look up. The silence that filled the house seemed endless. Back at Margaret's cottage, dinner was winding down. The last of the mashed potatoes and roasted carrots had been passed around, and everyone was leaning back in their chairs, content, the soft glow of the table lights casting long shadows on the walls. Margaret stood by the window, her hands folded, watching the snow fall outside. It was a quiet moment, the kind of peace she had craved for years. Doris raised her glass, her voice warm and clear. "To new beginnings," she said, her eyes locking with Margaret's, "to finding peace in the chaos, and to the strength it took to get here." Margaret's heart swelled and she raised her glass in response. "To new beginnings," she repeated. She felt a sense of belonging, of peace, that she hadn't felt in a long time. It was as though the world outside, covered in snow and quiet, was reflecting the calm inside her, finally. Just as Margaret was about to take a sip, a sudden knock echoed from the door. It was sharp, urgent, and it startled the room into a hushed stillness. Margaret's hand froze halfway to her mouth, her gaze flicking to Doris. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who could that be?" Doris asked, her voice laced with curiosity. Margaret's chest tightened, but she stood up slowly, her eyes narrowing as she made her way to the door. She wasn't sure what to expect, whether it would be someone from the neighborhood or a messenger with more news she wasn't ready to hear. She didn't know if she was ready for any of it. When she opened the door, her eyes met the last person she expected to see. Ethan. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion and something else. Guilt. Regret. He stood there for a moment, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. Margaret's heart raced in her chest and she took a deep breath. She wasn't sure what she was feeling anymore. She hadn't expected this. But she also hadn't been prepared to face it. Ethan finally spoke, his voice tight, almost pleading. "Mom, can we talk?" Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, her heart pounding as she looked at Ethan, who stood just outside, the cold snow swirling around him like a halo. He was holding a duffel bag tightly in his hands, his eyes wide with regret, his expression strained. The faintest tremor in his posture made it clear. He wasn't just ashamed. He was broken. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind howled against the cottage, the only sound in the heavy, thick silence that stretched between them. Margaret's breath came in slow, deliberate exhalations, watching him stand there, waiting for her to make the next move. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the ground, then back to her. Brooke." "She left," he said quietly, almost as though it was a confession. Margaret didn't reply immediately. The words didn't come easily. She had known this was coming, in some way. She had expected the mess, the fallout, the chaos that Brooke's departure would bring. But hearing it aloud felt different. Still, it didn't surprise her. None of this surprised her anymore. "I know," she said, her voice cold and distant, despite the heat in her chest. "I know what she did." Ethan's shoulders sagged even further, the weight of everything crashing down on him. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. His face was pale, drawn, his eyes filled with unshed tears that he refused to let fall. "I don't know where to go, Mom," he finally murmured. His voice was tight, raw, and for a moment, Margaret almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Margaret stepped back slightly, glancing over her shoulder toward the warm glow of the kitchen. The table was set, the last remnants of the Christmas meal slowly fading into the quiet of the evening. It was her moment, her first real holiday in years without the burden of pretending. And now, Ethan was here, asking for more. She turned back to face him, her expression unreadable, cold. She could feel the shift inside her, that tightening of resolve she had worked so hard to build. It had taken years of her life to come to this point. She had bled for his future, but now it was time to stop giving. She stood straighter, the warmth of the cottage retreating in the face of her new clarity. "You're not welcome here unless you've earned it, Ethan," she said quietly, her voice steady. "This table," she gestured to the cozy, mismatched chairs inside, "is for those who respect it." Ethan's face flickered with hurt, but he didn't move. He stood there, looking at her, perhaps waiting for her to soften, for her to be the mother he had always relied on. But Margaret wasn't that woman anymore. Not the one who gave endlessly without being seen, not the one who sacrificed her worth for those who walked all over it. "Can I come in?" Ethan asked, his voice cracking with vulnerability, his duffel bag still clutched tightly in his hands. Margaret didn't immediately step aside. She studied him, her gaze hardening as she met his eyes. She saw the desperation, the shame, the quiet pleading, but none of it made her falter. She had spent too long trying to fix things that were never her fault. Too long trying to hold together a family that had already unraveled. It wasn't her responsibility anymore. After what felt like an eternity, Margaret finally stepped aside, her body language controlled, calm. She said nothing, but her silence was louder than any words could have been. She wasn't inviting him in for comfort. She was setting the terms of their new relationship, one where he had to find his way, not her. Ethan hesitated at the threshold for a moment, as though unsure whether to cross it. But then, he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the cottage, its warmth, its simplicity, its authenticity. For the first time in a long time, he looked out of place here. The rich, polished home he had built with Brooke, all the promises and struggles, felt so far removed from this quiet, humble space. Margaret turned and walked to the kitchen, pouring herself another glass of wine, her movements calm, methodical. She didn't look back at him as she filled the glass. She didn't have to. This moment was about her. It was about the boundaries she had drawn and the peace she was choosing, no matter what came next. Ethan took a few hesitant steps into the room, but he stopped, his gaze lingering on her. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Mom. I never did," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. Margaret's hand froze around the wine glass, but she didn't turn to face him. "Then you shouldn't have treated me like I didn't matter," she said, her voice low but unwavering. There was no answer. The silence between them was thick, unspoken apologies hanging in the air, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Not after everything. Margaret raised her glass to her lips and took a slow sip, feeling the warmth of the wine fill her body. Outside, the wind howled against the walls of the cottage, but inside she was still and certain. As she set the glass down, the door closed behind Ethan with a soft click. He had entered her space, but this time, it was not for comfort. It was for him to face the consequences of his choices. He had entered her world now. The soft click of the door signaled something more. Margaret was no longer waiting for him to come back to her. She was standing firm in her own life, with or without him. The cottage hummed with laughter, the chatter of new friends, and the clink of glasses being raised. Margaret sat at the center of it all, her back straight, her smile easy, her energy undeniable. She glowed, as though the weight of the years had finally lifted from her shoulders. Her guests, neighbors, veterans, the widows who had become her close friends, surrounded her, their voices filled with warmth and connection. Margaret had built this space, brick by brick, with dignity and grace. It was a place where she could finally feel seen, not as a mother or a wife, but as herself. Ethan sat at the far end of the table, the glass of wine in his hand barely touched. His eyes darted from one face to the next, watching Margaret's ease with the people who filled her life now. They laughed, they teased, they shared stories. Simple, honest moments. And through it all, Margaret shone in the center, the anchor, the heart of the room. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen her like this. It made something inside him twist, a sharp pang of regret that he couldn't push aside. His place at the table felt distant, out of place. He was here physically, but emotionally, he was miles away. The warmth of the room didn't reach him the way it reached the others. His heart still felt cold. The laughter filled the spaces around him, but it didn't seem to include him. He was an observer, a stranger in his own home. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, suffocating him with every laugh, every gentle word spoken in his mother's direction. Margaret caught his eye once, her gaze steady but unreadable. She acknowledged him, but there was no softness in her eyes, no forgiveness, not yet. He was still on the outside looking in. Still, the fact that she hadn't asked him to leave yet felt like a small victory. But he knew it meant nothing. He had to earn more than her permission to stay. He had to earn her trust, her love, her respect. "I'm sorry, Mom," he muttered under his breath, the words barely escaping as he clenched his fist around the glass. It felt like a feeble attempt at atonement, a whisper in the cacophony of the evening, but he couldn't stop himself. Doris, who sat beside Margaret, noticed. She caught his eyes for a brief moment, and a knowing nod passed between her and Margaret. Doris didn't say anything aloud, but the unspoken understanding between them was clear. Margaret had drawn a line, a clear, unmistakable boundary. Ethan had crossed it, and now he was on his own path, no longer sheltered by the illusion of his mother's endless forgiveness. Margaret caught Doris's glance and nodded subtly in return. She wasn't cold. She wasn't vengeful. But she wasn't willing to offer the forgiveness Ethan sought. Not yet. Not after everything. Her gaze softened briefly, but it didn't waver. She was firm. This was her moment, and Ethan's reckoning had only just begun. Ethan knew that now. He wasn't here as a son seeking comfort or refuge. He wasn't here to be pampered. He was here because he had nowhere else to go. And the hardest part was that he realized, finally, he had to earn his way back into her life, into her heart. She had no more patience for empty promises or broken assurances. Her forgiveness couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. The evening continued around him. Laughter, the clinking of glasses, the warmth of a full table. But Ethan's mind was elsewhere, spinning with guilt, with remorse. He could feel the weight of his mother's disappointment, a weight that hadn't lifted even with his return. And in that moment, he understood something that had eluded him for so long. He had never truly seen her. Not until now. Not until she had drawn this line in the sand, a line that he could either cross or stay behind. She had spent so many years bending for him, giving everything, making sure he had every chance to succeed while sacrificing herself. But now, it was his turn to step up. His heart was heavy with the knowledge that, for the first time, he had to be the one to change. Not her. Not the world around him. Him. Margaret rose from the table, her posture elegant as she made her way to the kitchen, leaving Ethan with his thoughts and the remains of the holiday meal. The soft murmur of conversation filled the room, but Ethan barely registered it. He was still lost in the enormity of his own failings. As Margaret entered the kitchen, Doris followed, leaving a light-hearted conversation behind. Margaret turned to face her, the weight of the evening sinking in. She could feel Ethan's eyes on her still, but it no longer mattered. She had done what she needed to do. She had set the boundary, and now it was up to him to cross it. She picked up the last of the empty glasses, a slow sigh escaping her lips. "He's here, but not yet," she said softly, more to herself than to Doris. Doris gave a small, understanding nod. "It'll take time," she said. "But you've done the hardest part." Margaret nodded. She knew this was only the beginning. Ethan had a long road ahead of him, and so did she. But tonight, She felt something she hadn't in years. She felt in control. The morning light filtered softly through the window, casting a pale glow across the cottage. The snow had finally stopped, leaving the world outside blanketed in a soft, pristine white. Everything was still. The fire in the hearth crackled gently, the only sound in the house. Margaret woke slowly, stretching beneath the thick woolen blanket. Her body ached in the way it always did after a full night's sleep, but this time it felt different. The weight of the past few days, weeks, seemed to lift, if only slightly. Today she would begin to let go of the remnants of the old life. Her gaze fell on the table, where the remnants of last night's gathering still lingered. Half-filled wine glasses, empty plates, and mismatched chairs pushed against the walls. The evening had ended quietly, everyone leaving with heartfelt hugs and gratitude, their laughter still echoing in the corners of the room. It had been everything she needed, a reminder of the warmth of connection, the importance of community, and of her own strength. As the last of the guests departed, Margaret had taken a moment to breathe, to truly absorb the peace that surrounded her. The quiet of the cottage, the comfort of familiar faces, and the warmth that had become her own. She stood and walked toward the window, the chill of the morning air on her cheeks as she pulled back the curtain. A blanket of snow covered the ground, a world waiting to be shaped anew. Downstairs, the faint sound of footsteps crept from the hallway. Ethan. She hadn't heard him leave, but now he was lingering in the doorway, his shoulders hunched, his face drawn with a mixture of shame and uncertainty. Margaret paused, the warmth of the room surrounding her. She felt no anger now, only the cold clarity of what was necessary. Ethan had no place here until he had earned it, until he could finally see her for who she was. Not just as his mother, but as a woman who had given everything and had nothing left to give freely. She walked slowly to the table and placed the set of keys in the center. The house keys, the ones that had once belonged to her, the ones that had been taken and passed around like ownership was ever theirs to claim. Ethan stood in the doorway, eyes downcast. He hadn't moved closer, hadn't crossed the threshold. His hands were shaking slightly, holding his coat tightly against his chest. Margaret's gaze was steady, unwavering as she placed the keys gently on the table between them. She had no need for dramatic words, no need to lash out or vent the hurt that had built over the years. The silence spoke volumes. She had already said everything in the way she carried herself, in the strength she had finally come to know. "You'll rebuild trust before you rebuild anything else," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm, every word clear and unyielding. Ethan didn't speak. His eyes flickered briefly to the keys on the table, then back to her. The weight of her words settled between them like a wall neither could ignore. Margaret waited. She wasn't going to chase him anymore. The road ahead of them wasn't hers to walk. Not until he had done the work to rebuild himself, to rebuild the parts of him that had crumbled under his own choices. Ethan's voice came quietly, almost as a whisper. "I don't deserve it." Margaret felt the heat of her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to tell him it was all right, to tell him that time would heal all wounds, but she didn't. This time, she stayed quiet. Ethan stood there for a long moment, his hands trembling as he reached for the keys. He didn't pick them up. He just stared at them, as though understanding for the first time the full extent of what they represented. Not just a house, but his mother's heart. And it was no longer something to take for granted. Margaret moved toward the fire, the crackle of the flames filling the room with a gentle sound. She sat down slowly, her hands resting on her knees. Her gaze fell on the table, but she didn't look back at him. Ethan still stood in the doorway, the keys untouched between them. But she wasn't concerned with his reaction anymore. She had made her decision, and now it was his turn to prove that he could be worthy of the life she had built for herself. She sighed, the weight of it all settling on her shoulders in a way that felt different than before. She had taken more than the house keys back from him. She had taken her dignity, her peace, her self-respect. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt the stirrings of hope, of something new, something that was finally hers. Ethan cleared his throat softly, the sound of it breaking through the stillness. "I will," he said, his voice rough, raw with emotion. Margaret didn't answer. There was nothing more to say. She had given him the space he needed to grow, and now it was up to him to walk that path. Outside, the snow continued to fall, a world still waiting to be shaped. And inside, Margaret sat by the fire, peaceful. Finally, she had everything she needed: